The glow of a forgotten phone sliced through the dim hallway, its screen lighting my shaking hands as if exposing a truth I was never meant to see. I remember the cold floor beneath my feet, the distant hum of the refrigerator, and the way my heart stopped when I read the message that should have been impossible. If you've ever felt your world tilt in a single breath, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from, because moments like that can happen to anyone. I stood there, unable to breathe, realizing that everything I believed about loss, about death, about my own sanity, might have been built on a lie. That was the moment everything started to unravel. The evening had been so ordinary that it almost felt unreal when everything shifted beneath me. I walked into my living room expecting silence, the kind that had become a second skin over the years, but instead my eyes caught something that didn't belong. A phone, face down on my coffee table. Not mine. Not anything I recognized. Just sitting there as if it had been waiting for me to notice it. For a moment, I tried to convince myself I'd forgotten something, misplaced something, anything that would explain why a stranger's phone was resting in the center of my home. But the truth pressed harder the longer I stared. I lived alone. No one had been here. My world didn't have room for surprises anymore, yet here one was, breathing against the soft lamp glow. Before I could reach for it, the screen lit up. No sound, no vibration, just a single message rising to the surface like a warning breaking through still water. The words pulled the air straight from my lungs. Someone I had buried in my mind and in the ground was suddenly being spoken about as if she were still here. My thoughts jolted so violently it felt like my own heartbeat was stumbling. I told myself it had to be a mistake, that grief was twisting something simple into something impossible. But the fear lodged itself deeper with every passing second, whispering that this moment wasn't random. It was a fracture, and whatever waited on that phone was about to drag me backward into a past I had never truly escaped. Grief has a way of settling into the corners of a home until it becomes part of the air you breathe. For years, that was my reality. After losing my daughter Emily, the world around me seemed to fade into softer, muted colors, as if life itself were trying not to overwhelm me. I learned to move through my days with a kind of careful quiet, building routines that kept me from shattering. Morning coffee at the same spot near the window. Evenings spent folding the same blankets I rarely used. Little rituals that helped me survive the emptiness. Holidays were the hardest. I used to pretend they were just days on a calendar. But the silence inside my house always felt heavier when the rest of the world was celebrating. Emily's room remained exactly as she left it, untouched and waiting. Though I never said that out loud, I would stand in the doorway sometimes, letting the stillness wrap around me like a memory I couldn't bring myself to disturb. Michael's death had come years before Emily's, and his loss carved a hollow space inside me that I never figured out how to refill. When Emily passed, it felt like the last part of my foundation gave way. After that, grief became something I carried the way other people carried wallets or keys, always with me, always within reach. Through all of this, Ryan Keller existed on the outskirts of my life. A polite neighbor, steady in his routines, never intrusive. The kind of person you barely think about because there is never a reason to. Yet the phone I found earlier, the one that did not belong in my living room, was his. And that simple detail made the message feel even more impossible. As I stood there replaying years of loss in my mind, A new feeling threaded its way through the familiar sorrow, unease. Something about this moment didn't fit the quiet shape of my life, and I realized I was no longer just grieving. I was starting to question everything I thought I understood. My hands hovered over the phone as if touching it might ignite something. The screen was still lit, waiting for me, holding the message that had already cracked open the quiet life I'd built around my grief. I told myself to breathe, to think. But the moment my fingers brushed the phone, a tremor ran through me so sharply it felt like my body understood the danger before my mind did. I opened the message. The words were simple, almost casual, yet they carried an impossible weight. Someone was talking about Emily as if she were still here, still moving through the world, still reachable. My vision blurred for a moment, and I had to steady myself against the table. Grief had played tricks on me before, but never like this. Never with something so concrete I could feel its shape in my hands. I forced myself to scroll. Each message felt like a blow. Cryptic instructions, updates written in present tense, references that only someone close to her would understand. My pulse pounded as I kept scrolling, dread pulling me deeper into months of hidden conversations. Then I saw it. A photo. Faint, grainy, but unmistakable. Emily. Older than the last time I held her. But her. Alive in a way my heart wasn't prepared to accept. Something inside me split cleanly in two. The grief I had carried for so long twisted into something sharper, hotter. Rage, clarity. A sudden understanding that everything I believed about her death, about my own life, might have been built on lies. As I stared at the screen, the room felt smaller, the air heavier. I knew I couldn't unsee any of it. Whatever this was, however deep it went, I had to follow it. And that realization was the moment everything truly began to unravel. I sat there staring at the phone long after the screen dimmed, unable to steady the shaking in my chest. The messages kept replaying in my mind, pulling loose threads I had tucked away years ago. It felt as if someone had reached into the past and yanked it violently into the present, leaving everything inside me unanchored. My thoughts drifted back to the funeral, to the way I accepted every explanation without question. The closed casket, the gentle reassurance that it was better that way. At the time, I was so consumed by loss that I clung to anything that made the moment easier to survive. I never asked for details. I never demanded to see her one last time. I told myself it was my heart protecting itself, but now I could feel the weight of that choice pressing hard against my ribs. Grief had made me quiet. It had taught me to trust whatever I was told because the alternative felt too painful to imagine. Looking back, there were moments that should have unsettled me, small hesitations, strained expressions, things I dismissed because I was too numb to recognize them. Now each memory felt sharp, like glass catching light in places I never noticed before. The world I thought I understood was shifting, tilting, revealing cracks I had overlooked. And beneath all the shock and confusion, a new feeling began to form, thin at first, but growing steadier. A sense of direction, a need to step out of the fog I had lived in for so long. If Emily was alive, or if someone wanted me to believe she was, I couldn't face this alone. And that realization became the first solid thing I had felt in years. The longer I stood there with the phone in my hand, the clearer it became that I couldn't carry this alone. The fear was too heavy, the possibilities too dangerous. I needed someone steady, someone who knew both Michael and Emily, someone who would believe me even if the truth sounded impossible. That person had always been Mark Lawson. He had a way of grounding chaos, even when his own grief ran deep. When I finally reached him, the words came out in fragments: fear, hope, disbelief tangled together. I watched his expression shift from concern to a seriousness that settled like iron. He didn't question my sanity or dismiss what I showed him. He took the phone from my hands with a calm I didn't feel, scrolling through the messages with the focus of someone piecing together a map. I could sense his urgency even before he said anything. He began documenting everything: screenshots, timestamps, notes, moving with a firmness that made my heart pound. In his silence, I heard the truth I had tried to avoid. Whatever this was, it wasn't a misunderstanding. It was deliberate. He told me we couldn't wait, that sitting on this would be dangerous. I felt my breath hitch at the thought of involving authorities, but he reminded me that if Emily was alive or being used, every second mattered. His resolve steadied mine. By the time we stepped out into the cold night air, the decision was made. We were going to the police, and whatever happened next would change everything. The drive to the station felt unreal, but standing beside the officers as they approached the Keller house felt even stranger, as if I had stepped outside my own life and into someone else's nightmare. The street looked exactly as it always had: quiet lawns, soft porch lights, the faint smell of damp leaves, but everything inside me pulsed with dread. Mark stayed close, steadying me with his presence, but even that couldn't calm the pounding in my chest as I watched the officers fan out across the yard. The house looked peaceful in a way that felt almost mocking. I had walked past it countless times without a second thought, never imagining what might be hidden behind its calm exterior. When Marjorie Keller opened the door, she wore an expression of confusion that might have fooled me once, back when I trusted surfaces. But the officers didn't hesitate. They stepped past her, their movements purposeful, their voices low and firm. I saw a flicker of something cross her face: panic, maybe, or anger. But she quickly tried to redirect them, gesturing toward the kitchen as if the problem they sought couldn't possibly be anywhere else. The officers ignored her. They moved down the hallway toward a door I had never noticed before, a heavy one, locked. The kind of door that didn't belong in a house like this. My breath caught. My hands went cold. Every second stretched thin as I watched them gather, tools ready, their shoulders tense with the weight of what they might find. The air felt tight around me, as if the entire world were holding still. When the first officer reached for the lock, my heart felt like it stopped. The door hadn't opened yet, but everything inside me already knew what was waiting behind it. When the officers forced the basement door open, a cold breath of air pushed out as if the darkness itself exhaled. I didn't wait to be asked. I followed them down the narrow steps, each one groaning under our weight. The light from their flashlights sliced through the black, catching dust suspended in the air, revealing walls that felt too close, too damp, too silent. My heartbeat was so loud in my ears that it drowned out everything else. The basement smelled of earth and something stale, the kind of scent that clings to forgotten places. As I stepped off the last stair, my eyes adjusted just enough to take in the shape of the room. Concrete floor, a thin mattress pressed into one corner, blankets piled in a way that spoke of nights spent curled for warmth. A bowl sat abandoned near the wall. None of it looked like a place meant for living. It looked like a place meant for hiding someone away. One of the officers' lights swept low, catching movement. A small shape, curled tightly, almost blending into itself. My breath stopped. The room tilted. Every part of me recognized what my mind refused to accept. A figure, frail, still, tucked into the shadows as though trying to disappear. My knees gave way before I reached her, but I kept moving, pulling myself toward the light pooling around her body. And then her face came into view, older, thinner, ghosted by fear and exhaustion, but unmistakable. Emily, my daughter, the child I buried in my heart, the heartbeat I thought I lost forever. Something inside me broke open. I reached for her with hands trembling so badly I could barely touch her. When my fingers brushed her skin, warm and real, I felt my entire world rearrange itself in an instant. She lifted her head slightly, a tiny movement that shattered me completely. The officers were already calling for medical support, their voices urgent, echoing up the stairs. But all I could do was gather her into my arms, feeling the fragile weight of her against my chest, whispering gratitude inside my own mind that she was alive. As they prepared to move her toward help, I held on to one truth with every breath. This nightmare was ending, and my daughter was finally coming back into the light. The hospital lights felt almost too bright after the darkness of that basement, as if the world was trying to cleanse what we had just crawled out of. I walked beside the gurney while the nurses hurried Emily into an exam room, my hands hovering near her but afraid to touch her too much, afraid she might slip away if I held her too tightly. The sterile smell of antiseptic wrapped itself around us, a strange kind of safety compared to the damp cold she had been living in for years. I stood in the corner while doctors evaluated her, watching monitors flicker with numbers I couldn't interpret. Every time her eyes fluttered closed, my heart clenched. I kept expecting her to vanish again, as if this rescue might dissolve into another cruel illusion. But then she would stir, her gaze drifting toward me with a recognition so faint and fragile that it nearly brought me to my knees. When she was finally stable enough to rest, I sat beside her bed, listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing, slowly, in broken moments between exhaustion and fear. She began to share what had happened, not in full sentences, not in anything clear, but in pieces. A voice telling her I had let her go, promises that she would be safe only if she obeyed, a twisted world built on lies meant to keep her silent. She told me she never stopped hoping I would find her. That tiny thread of belief had kept her alive. Hearing it felt like being split open. Relief, grief, rage, love. They all rushed in at once. And even as I held her hand, I could sense there was more hidden beneath her trembling words, more that would soon come to light. The truth was only beginning to surface, and part of it was waiting for me outside that hospital room. When the investigators asked to revisit Michael's toxicology results, I didn't think much of it at first. His death had been labeled sudden, tragic, but natural. A heart that simply gave out too soon. I had accepted that truth because I needed to, but when they told me a sedative had been present in his system, one that should never have been dismissed, something inside me went numb. It felt as if the floor shifted beneath me. Every memory of his final days came rushing back. His unexplained fatigue, the way he kept saying he felt foggy, the night he told me he thought someone had been inside the house while we slept. I had brushed it off as stress, wanting so badly to believe we were safe. Now those moments glowed like warning signs I had failed to see. Realizing Michael hadn't simply died, that he had been silenced, hit harder than I knew grief could. The same people who took Emily had taken him from me too. They had been in our lives long before I understood the danger. The horror of that truth settled into something colder, sharper, betrayal. And beneath it, a resolve I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about justice. Walking into the courtroom with Emily at my side felt like stepping into a place where the air carried every unanswered question of the past 3 years. The room was quiet, but not peaceful, more like it was holding its breath. I could feel Emily's hand tremble against mine, and I squeezed it gently, reminding both of us that we were here to finish something that had nearly broken us. When the evidence was presented, it filled the room like a tide, photos, reports, recordings, every piece of truth laid out under lights that left no room for shadows. I watched David across the aisle, seeing the moment the weight became too much for him. His shoulders slumped, his eyes fell, and the truth poured out of him in a way that felt less like confession and more like collapse. It didn't bring satisfaction, only a somber acknowledgement of how deep the damage ran. Margaret, on the other hand, sat rigid, her denial wrapped around her like armor. Even as the evidence stacked higher, she clung to her own version of reality, refusing to look at me, refusing to look at Emily. Her silence was louder than anything she could have said. When the sentencing came, long-term imprisonment for both, I felt the verdict land not as victory, but as recognition. A public acknowledgement that what happened to my family mattered, that it was seen, that it would not be buried under lies again. Emily sat straighter beside me, as if some part of her finally believed she was safe. As we stepped out of the courtroom, the tension that had lived inside my body for years began to loosen, thread by thread. Justice didn't erase the pain, but it gave us a place to set it down. And from that moment on, the rest of our lives could finally begin. Walking back into the house after the sentencing felt strangely quiet, as if the walls themselves were taking their first full breath in years. Nothing in the rooms had changed, yet everything felt different. The shadows that once clung to corners were gone, replaced by a kind of honest emptiness. For the first time, the silence didn't terrify me. It simply waited. Emily moved through the hallway slowly, touching familiar things as if trying to reconnect pieces of herself. I watched her pause at her bedroom door, not frozen by grief this time, but steadying herself before stepping inside. She didn't close the door behind her. That small act felt like its own kind of healing. As days passed, we learned how to live beside the memories without being swallowed by them. Some moments were still heavy, but they didn't suffocate us anymore. The weight had shifted from something that crushed to something we could carry together. It was Emily who first asked if we could do something with what we had survived, something that might help others still waiting to be found. The idea grew slowly, taking shape as we talked late into the evenings. Turning our pain into purpose felt like reclaiming control over the years we lost. We created a foundation dedicated to supporting missing person families and survivors, offering resources we once needed but never had. Every step of building it felt like planting something new in soil that had finally cleared. Standing beside Emily as we opened its doors, I felt a quiet strength settle inside me. We weren't the same people who walked into that courtroom. We were learning how to begin again. And with that beginning came the space to finally reflect on what this journey had taught us. There are days when I still catch myself standing in the quiet of our home, trying to understand how we survived everything that nearly destroyed us. When I look at Emily now, healing, learning to breathe without fear, I'm reminded that survival isn't just endurance, it's transformation. It's the courage to step toward truth even when it threatens to break you. What we lived through reshaped the way I see the world. I learned that intuition is often the first flicker of truth, and ignoring it can cost more than we ever imagine. I learned that silence can be dangerous, and that asking hard questions is sometimes the only way to protect the people we love. And I learned that even in the darkest moments, hope can take root in places we think are barren. Turning our pain into purpose didn't erase the past, but it gave it meaning. It reminded us that our story doesn't end with what was taken from us. It continues with what we choose to build. If you've ever faced something that made you doubt yourself or pushed you to fight for answers you weren't ready to face, I hope our story reminds you that your voice matters. I'd love to hear your thoughts or your own experiences. Share them in the comments. I read everyone,